been a bit of a rough week, I think it's safe to say. After Ash Wednesday service, I got home and saw the terrible news of yet another shooting in Florida. Yet another reason why driving into church this morning, the flags around town were at half staff. Then I opened up my tablet to pull up my sermon when I got here to church, and there was a lovely advertisement. How to prevent an active shooter in your church. And I thought, this is ridiculous. And then I remembered something that a friend of mine said to me this week. What have you done about it? I'm like, what do you mean? I'm not in Congress. What do you mean, what have I done about it? He said, well, you're a pastor. That's what you're supposed to do about it. So I'm throwing out the sermon that I had planned for this week. And instead, I want to talk about life and death. That is the gospel this week. After all, it's Jesus raising Lazarus after he waited around for 2 days to even start traveling to where Lazarus was. It's interesting, isn't it? Like, you get to that part in the gospel and you're going, wait, Jesus really liked these people, and so he hung out where he was for 2 days. It doesn't make sense. It feels like almost that he doesn't care. If he liked Lazarus and Mary and Martha so much, why didn't he go straight to Bethany? It feels like God had left them behind. Even so, they get to town and Jesus hears people saying over again, oh, it's Jesus. If he'd have gotten here sooner, he might have saved Lazarus. How often in the midst of tragedy do we hear people saying, oh, if God had gotten there sooner, if God had been there, he would have kept that from happening. It happens with all kinds of things, right? We've probably even said it ourselves a time or two. And Jesus is hearing that this whole time. First thing Martha says to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. First thing Mary says to him, Lord, if you had been here. But then Jesus says this interesting thing. Your brother will rise again. Now Mary or Martha just goes, oh, well, yeah, I know. The resurrection is going to happen and he'll rise again at the resurrection. But Jesus says, no. That's not what I meant. I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me, even though they die, will not die. And I think Martha still didn't fully get it. Because she kind of goes with oh, well, yeah, you're the Son of God. You know what you're talking about. But then you get Jesus speaking to a guy who was 4 days dead in a tomb saying, come out. Now, back in those days, raising someone who was newly dead, not a huge deal. Even today, we're pretty good with our modern medicine about if someone dies for a little bit, we can bring them back a lot of the time. It's almost common. Where I've heard people say casually, oh yeah, I was in surgery and I died for about 10 minutes, but they brought me back. And even back then when they didn't have the medical technology, people would just look dead for a little bit and then they'd wake up and everything would be fine. But 4 days, that's a while. 4 days in the tomb is longer than any of Jesus' other miracles to this point. No one thought anything was going to happen when Jesus yelled at the tomb, Lazarus, come out. Because Lazarus was dead. There was no hope for Lazarus coming back. Nothing. And yet Jesus said, Lazarus, come out. And Lazarus comes out of the tomb. 4 days stinky. Comes out of the tomb. And Jesus just says, take the bandages off and let him go on his way. Now, when it comes to the deaths that we see around us, the deaths that we experience, there's a lot of platitudes that people give. There's a lot of things that people say. And the response is usually like Martha's response to Jesus. Oh yeah, I know that the resurrection's going to happen, but what does that do for me now? But Jesus, instead of leaving it there, spoke life to Martha, spoke life to Mary. Because Jesus didn't just let it stay at the nice saying. He didn't let it just stay at, your brother will rise again at the resurrection. He told her, anyone who believes in me will rise again, even though they die. And then he did something. He went and he raised Lazarus. Now, most of us, we're probably not going to raise someone who's been in a tomb for 4 days. But we can still speak life into situations where it seems like there's only death. We can still speak life to people who are hurting. And oftentimes the ways that we speak life to people is not in saying things, but it's in letting them say what they need to say. It's letting them say, if your God had been here, this wouldn't have happened. If your God had done something, this wouldn't have happened. And sometimes that's the very thing that people need to do, is to just be listened to in these situations. Because it's not about what everyone is saying. How often do you see a politician say something and it's almost utterly meaningless when it comes to these tragedies? It's not a one side of the party divide or another issue. They all say something meaningless because they don't back it up. I don't like talking about these things. In 1999, someone shot up a high school in Colorado, and it's still happening because we let them do nothing. We let them do nothing. They haven't even done the wrong thing. And it's time for we as a church to speak life to this thing of death that is our problem. It's time for we as a church to stand up and say, no more death, because we know life. I've seen people say over and over what the issue isn't. But I think what it comes down to is we are not speaking life. We are not saying that Jesus is resurrection. We are not saying that in moments like this, people matter. We are not saying the things that Jesus would have us say. And we cower behind platitudes. We cower behind saying the nice thing. And because we as a church are afraid. After so many church shootings, I had some of my pastor friends just tell me and tear up as they're saying it, we had to do active shooter drills in our church. That hurts me. That we are in a world that churches have to prepare for that. I don't know what the answer is, but I know that we can still speak life. We can speak these words of Jesus, that we know who life is. Because it's not about one thing. It's about the one thing. You hear people on one side saying, oh, let's arm teachers, saying another side saying, let's get rid of all the guns. Neither of those are the answer. But we know who the answer is. And we know the answer is someone who cares about an insignificant family in Bethany enough to stop what he was doing after a little bit and go to this town that he and his disciples all know are close enough to Jerusalem that he is going to get killed if he goes there. And he goes to be with this family of Lazarus, Mary, and Martha. It's someone who literally put his life on the line for the people he loved. He did it for Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, and he does it for us. Because God went to the cross for life. He went to the cross to die for us for life. And he says to us, take up your cross and follow me. He spoke life to death. And then he backed it up with his actions. Those who believe in me will never die because he died. Jesus is the resurrection because he rose first. Because he was killed for us. Jesus says earlier in the gospel, greater love has no, or later in the gospel somewhere, greater love has no one than this, that he lay down his life for another. That's how he spoke life. The words that he said, he backed up with action. The words that he said, he backed up with everything that he was. And so how do we speak life to the death that is around us? Is it in just listening to those who have stories to share? Yes, that's part of it. But it's also in fighting for change, in fighting for something new that respects life. Historically, the church has been very good fighting for these issues. The church is one of the key reasons why slavery ended in this country. The church is at the forefront of the fight against people using abortions as birth control. The church is at the front of that. There are more fights for life that we can be at the front of. It's a risk. People might not like us very much for this. But if we're following someone who says, take up your cross, we as Christians should be willing to do what Jesus did, and if necessary, die to save another. Because that is who we claim to follow. Someone who did just that. Someone who died to save all of us. And if we really want to follow him, that's as far as we must be willing to go. We must be willing to lay our lives down to speak life. Because that is what Jesus modeled, that kind of life is for us. We should be like Thomas, who sees what Jesus does and go, you know what? Let's go die with him, if that's what it takes. Because greater love has no one than this, to lay down their life for another. We need to fight for life. Because the one we followed called us to do just that. Jesus died to give us life and calls us to speak that life to those around us. And because we have life, we needn't fear death. And that is good news in the midst of all these tragedies. It's good news when everything is going well. But it's news that people need to hear. It's news that we have been holding close to us for too long. And we need to speak life into this world full of death.